All right. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, aka Mr. Delks Moses, aka Mr. Anoints Himself with Grease, governed by caprice. Shout out to my guy Kamal for jumping into the live stream chat. Pound to you, brother. Today is April 5th, 2025. The time where I'm at right now is about 5:06 p.m. And we are continuing our Book to React series, Book to React number 10, episode 7, with Racism in Europe by Neil MacMaster. This is a powerful book that came out in 2001, the year 2000. Or was it the year 2001? I'm sorry. Yes, it was the year 2001, but it covers the years 1870 to 2000. Sorry, I forgot that. Anyway, you can pick up this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $22.52. Great book that we've been reading that covers a wide swath of history in various angles, covering anti-blackness and the history of anti-Semitism as well on the continent, the European continent. Now, we're going to be reading, but before we do that, we're going to jump into the comment section. As I say at the beginning of every Book to React series, if you can't join the live stream where I read all the comments live with the people, I will always read the comments for people that jump in there afterwards. And we have one new comment that I think is fabulous. This is a wonderful, awesome comment that I got from this woman, I presume, whose name is Virtuous Glean 7216. And she put this under the second Book to React episode for Book to React 10. And that seems to be the episode that's going viral. It's got over 400 views. I think people are sharing it because I said a funny joke about Vaseline in it, and people are maybe sharing that part. But hopefully they stick around for the reading and the live reactions. Anyway, Virtuous Glean said this: the reason that is separated from the racism of the transatlantic slave trade is because vilification of Jews started with religion, and the Romani were seen as nonconformists with Christian society. Jewish and Muslim conversions were questioned in Spain because they were on edge about the Moorish rule, and it was a clash with Islam, and Jews had helped Muslims due to the Christian bigotry. They alleged that the conversions could be fake infiltration or still embracing heresy. So some beliefs about blood did start there in Spain over all of that. But full-on white supremacy itself was based specifically on defining blackness via the slave trade, which is why they said so much about blackness. Once again, this woman right here, Virtuous Glean, is somebody who's using that muscle in between her shoulders. She's using her brain. She's reacting to the text. This is a beautiful comment. This is really not well written because there are some mistakes here. I think, we can piece together what she's trying to say. Maybe English is her second language, but this is very, very true. I mean, once again, I've said this during the readings of this text, and Neil MacMaster is bolstering the claim that before the Europeans started, everything they did with essentializing blackness, essentializing black people as having certain characteristics and us being less than human, they were practicing this on the Jews. They were practicing on the Romani. They were practicing on their own women for centuries before they got us. And yes, I've said this before. I argued with my anthropology professor in university about this. He was making the claim, basically racism was invented when they, captured black Africans and brought them to the Americas. But I would say no, because once again, as she said here, and as Neil MacMaster has said in the text, the Jews were essentialized because of their blood. Even when the Spanish Christian kings reconquered Hispaniola, they said the Jewish converts to Christianity are not true Christians because their blood is Jewish, and they will never be true Christians. Therefore, we should kill them, or therefore we should oppress them, etc., right? They said the same thing about Muslims as well, and various other groups of people like the Romani. So yes, white supremacy is built on anti-blackness, but there was a practice stage. Before you become professional in anything, for example, before you become a professional baller, you got to hoop at the courts. You got to go to the YMCA. You got to get a coach. You got to join your high school team. But when you make it to the league, that's when you're really balling. Before the white folks hit the league of white supremacy, before they were balling out of control with anti-black racism and fully established white supremacy all over the globe, they were practicing in the courts every single day with the Jews, with the Romanis, with their own women. Facts. Facts. Shout out Virtuous Glean for this comment. I hope she continues to come back into the comment section and drop her 2 cents on everything that we're reading about in this book. And more people leave comments as well, because I love getting comments that shows that people are reading the text, interacting with the text, and really jumping in. So once again, before we start every Book to React series, we will always read the comments. I won't read the comments for other videos, only Book to React, because that's what we're trying to promote here. Education, people using those cells in their brain, et cetera, et cetera. So, continuing here in Neil MacMaster's book, we're on page 82 in the PDF, or 73 on the actual text, and we're starting here with exhibiting blacks in Europe. You know what's interesting? I think in this section he's going to talk about the zoos, the human zoos, when black people were put on zoos and displayed all throughout Europe. And today, before I started this live stream, I know a lot of you think I live online, but I went downtown to Budapest today. I'm in Budapest, Hungary. For people that still say, where are you, Simon? I'm in Budapest, Hungary. I went downtown to the city park. We have a large city park here. And I was hanging out with one of my friends from Africa. He's a Liberian brother. And we were chatting and stuff like that. And I was telling him that, you know, about 100 years ago in this very park, they had an exhibit of black people in a zoo. Basically, black people living as they did in Africa in a closed-off pen where white folks will point at them, laugh at them, and throw food at them. So yes, that did happen in Budapest, Hungary, as it did many other major European cities. But let's continue here. Exhibiting blacks in Europe. From 1870 onwards, popular attitudes towards the blacks were significantly shaped by the great international fairs, a process of exhibiting the provided framework through which most Europeans caught sight of the African in the flesh and confirmed a sense of inherent white superiority. This practice was an extension of a much older tradition. For many centuries, natives of Africa and the Americas had been captured and brought to Europe as objects of curiosity, but the exploitation of savages in shows developed greatly during the 19th century as an aspect of traveling circuses, leisure gardens, music hall speculators, and other forms of mass popular entertainment. Between 1810 and 1815, a Boer farmer exhibited Sarti Bartman, known as the Venus Hottentot, or Hottentot Venus, in London and Paris in a kind of freak show, and even then caused some scandal by the degrading way she was paraded because of her steatophagia, or prominent buttocks, in order to move backwards and forwards and come out and go into her cage, more like a bear on a chain than a human being. We reviewed the film Black Venus. If you have not seen this film, turn off this live stream right now and go watch Black Venus. It is one of the best films ever made, one of the most powerful feminist films ever made, one of the best black films ever made, one of the best French films ever made. Shout out to that movie. Acty and I also did a review for that film as well, so go check that out on this channel. So, continuing here. Another nude black Venus was paraded in 1829 at the ball of the Duchess du Barry in Paris. The commercial possibilities of such spectacles was recognized by major circus and showground entrepreneurs, like the Americans Barnum and Bailey, who toured both the United States and Europe. However, the full potential for the display of live savage peoples was developed furthest by the huge universal exhibitions and colonial and trade fairs that, following on from the first great exhibition at the Crystal Palace in 1851, proliferated throughout the cities of Western Europe. Between 1878 and 1914, during the height of the conquest and partition of Africa, exhibitions, frequently constructed on a vast scale, were an annual occurrence throughout Europe. Although the major locations were Paris in 1867, 78, 87, 89, and 80, 91, 93, and 1900, and London, 86, 92, 97, 99, 1903, 08, and 24. International exhibitions were also held in Moscow in 1872, Vienna, 1873, Italy, 1888, Germany, 1891, Antwerp, 1894, and Brussels, 1897, 1910, as well as in major provincial cities like Glasgow, 1901, Cork, 1902, Wolverhampton, 1902 and 1907, Bradford, 1904, Liège, 1905, and Marseille, 1906. The reason why he listed all of those cities where they had these world fairs where people would exhibit curiosities and inventions and peculiar things from different parts of the world is because in all of those cities, they had black people on display as animals, as savages. Continuing here. In the era before the significant spread of the cinema, such speculators were enormously popular and attracted huge gates. The Paris World Fair of 1889 was attended by 39 million people, that of 1900 by 50 million. Special cheap excursion trains were laid onto the Marseille Colonial exhibition of 1906 from all over France and Germany. Attendance by workers at the Franco-British exhibition at White City, 1908, was encouraged by employers like Lever Brothers at Port Sunlight, who laid on 6 special trains for 3,500 workers. Through the international and provincial exhibitions, literally millions of Europeans who were to have a direct experience of Africans, an experience that provided the most powerful impetus to the diffusion of racial stereotypes. Millions of Europeans would travel all across the continent to primarily Paris, but to other cities as well, to watch black people in human zoos. Exhibitions and fairs, carefully planned and orchestrated stages for the selling of imperialism, conveyed a complex of explicit and implicit meanings that related to white colonial triumph and racial superiority. One of the most popular forms of spectacle was the reconstruction of famous military campaigns or battles in which white officers fought heroically in the arena with hordes of naked savages, with the Shanti, Dahomians, Zulus, Shona, and others. At the Savage South Africa show in Earl's Court, 1899 to 1900, the public was presented with a sight never seen previously in Europe, a horde of savages direct from their kraals, some 200 Zulu warriors. The Zulus reenacted the famous massacre of the Shangani Patrol in 1893, which, in the best traditions of public school heroism, went down patriotically singing "God Save the Queen." However, in such tableau vivant, the ferocious nature of the Zulu was always eventually contained by the superior discipline and manliness of British soldiers. So, once again, when we come across a word that we don't know in this live stream, we're going to look it up, because this man seems to love dropping French phrases in here. Why not just translate it, man? Why not just translate it? So let's look here. Tableau vivant. Tableau vivant, what is this? I need a dictionary man. I need a person, a woman, anybody to be my permanent dictionary person. All right, let's go here. So tableau vivant translates to a silent and motionless group of people arranged to represent a scene or incident. So basically people standing around doing the mannequin challenge. Okay. In the simulated battles, the inevitable defeat of the African was invariably portrayed as a stage of racial progress, a social Darwinian triumph. The press review of Savage Africa referred to the Matabele consenting to bite the dust in deference to the hot fire of the Maxims. Basically, the African willingly laying down and dying to project the image of social Darwinism, white supremacy, evolutionary progress, civilization conquering the savage, etc. Such military reenactments of the first stage of imperial conquest frequently legitimated colonial might through crude sensationalism and the most negative stereotypes of darkest Africa. Images of barbaric practices, bloody human sacrifice, cannibalism, slavery, and fetishism that it was the duty of the new masters to uproot. The Franco-British exhibition of 1908, for example, displayed gruesome trophies like the war drum beaten at executions, devil worship, visitors were informed, is associated with many of the curios, meaning that the black people worship the devil. Sinister indeed is a triple-faced mask covered with human skin layered from sacrificial victims. Time and again, military expeditions and conquests, as well as propaganda on behalf of the work of missionaries, was legitimated by such stereotypes, as with the French campaigns in Dahomey in 1890 and 1892. In 1890, the mass circulation French Illustrated Press had given extensive and sensationalist cover to human sacrifice in Dahomey, with images of snake worship, decapitated heads on spikes, and human crucifixion. It was because of this widespread public interest that Europeans flocked to see the newly conquered Dahomians, who were exhibited in Paris in 1893. The Dahomian troupe were so popular that they continued to tour Europe and America. And at the Paris World Fair of 1900, the Dahomian Pavilion was constructed in the form of a tower of sacrifice, decorated with pikes and the actual skulls of slaves executed before the eyes of King Behanzin. Going now to the comments, Kamal typed something, but then he retracted it. I don't know why. If you're gonna type something, just leave it up, man. Anyway, as far as the rumors of human sacrifice and cannibalism, did not the Europeans burn people alive at the stake? Did not in America we had the Salem witch trials where we drowned women for the joy of the audience? How are these not also considered human sacrifices when in the Europeans' civilization for hundreds of years, public hangings were the way of administering justice, or whipping on slaves in public was a way of administering justice in colonial America? It's so backwards to me that the Europeans say, oh, the Africans sacrifice humans right in front of them and eat them alive. Meanwhile, the European does very similar things with the cutting off of the penis of the black man, with the public floggings, with the public hangings, with all sorts of decapitations done by the guillotine to the joyful eyes of thousands of spectators. How can they honestly look themselves in the mirror and say the Africans are savage when at the same time they were guillotining their kings, their rulers, their leaders, etc., burning people alive at the stake like Joan of Arc? Continuing here. The second standard element in the exhibitions was the emphasis on the post-conquest phase of pacification and civilizing. The military performance or the direction of the spatial layout often moved sequentially from the first stage of military conflict to one of containment, in which the savages were presented as humbled and pacified subjects who responded with happiness to the enlightened direction of the colonial master. Going now to the comments. Kamal says tableau vivant, says living paint in French. Shout out to Kamal. You can be the dictionary man. If I see a word I don't know, you got to look it up and tell us what it is in the chat. Anyway, so the very process of placing recently conquered tribes on display in the European exhibitions was not unlike the ancient Roman parade of peoples as trophies of war. The subjugation and pacification of the Zulu was symbolized at the International Horticultural Exhibition of 1892 in London by a Zulu choir who performed Rossini and Sullivan. The great exhibitions, a vicarious tourist trip to the Dark Continent, accentuated the zoo-like quality of human display by placing the Africans in compounds. In the villages, the domestication of the savage was represented by the illusion of African women and children engaged in peaceful family life, usually open-air cooking, and in the transition to enlightenment and economic productivity, represented by handicrafts, the weaving and carving of objects that could be bought by the crowds. At the Paris World Fair of 1900, visitors would watch Africans being schooled in French by the Alliance Française. The Guide to the Imperial International Exhibition in London in 1909 emphasized the progressive and productivist logic of colonialism in the civilizing of the human-sacrificing Dahomians. Order and decency, trade and civilization have taken the place of rule by fear of the sword. France has placed its hands on the blackest spot in West Africa and wiped out some of the red stain that made Dahomey a byword in the world. Today, Dahomey is a self-governing colony of France with a revenue which exceeds its expenditure, a line of railway, rubber, and cotton plantations, exporting palm oil and copra, maize, nuts, dried fish, cattle, sheep, pigs, and fowl. Going now to the comments. Jerry Online says, and they have the nerve to say anyone black coming to Europe is bad because our culture is too savage and barbaric. Ain't that the truth, Jerry Online? The hypocrisy that comes out of the mouths of the white folks is so unbearable sometimes it literally breaks your brain. How can they say black people coming to Europe is somehow bringing savagery, backwardness, anti-civilization, when literally all of their civilization is predicated upon savagery upon the other, discrimination against the other, colonizing the other, sexually abusing the other. This is what European civilization is built upon. These are the building blocks. These are the foundations to everything that constructs their worldview of themselves and also the future and their past. Going now to the text though, when the French were saying that, hey, we colonized the Dahomey and we brought them out of backwardness, this goes to show that cultural relativism is important. We should realize that other cultures have different ways of doing things, and there is no culture that is backwards or uncivilized other than the culture of the white supremacists. other than the culture of the white supremacists, how people lived in Africa can be compared against to how people lived in Europe, and there are many similarities. There might be things we like how the Africans do it, might be things we like how the Europeans do it, but it's always hypocritical to say that one civilization or one culture or one way of living is inherently better than another. We might have ways that we prefer as individuals, but there is no culture that is superior to another. All right? Kamal says the hypocrisy is most disturbing. It is most disturbing indeed, but that's why we try to break it. We try to break it. So the major exhibitions were constructed on a truly vast scale. And in addition to the sites allocated to the various Dutch, French, British, Belgian, Italian, and Portuguese colonies, and the displays of economic wealth and tropical produce provided a setting for the latest and most advanced European technologies, from turbines to automobiles. The way in which the exhibition grounds were laid out in a complex of pavilions and streets was as a totalizing global experience, an encyclopedia of every land and people. The greatest racial and cultural contrast was established between the primitive mud hut villages of the Africans and the spectacular displays of European technological achievement, symbols of modernity, displayed in huge electrically lighted halls. Nor were such contrasts accidental, since exhibition designers began to plan layouts to correspond to a racial hierarchy, an evolutionary progression from the most primitive people, Dahomians, Hottentots, Ashanti, etc., via intermediary racial categories, Arabs, Chinese, Indian, to progressively higher types, the white dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and finally the United States and the various European nations. So what MacMaster is trying to help us visualize is what these world fairs were like. Imagine you were living back in 1900 or 1901, whatever, and you're in Paris at the World Fair. You're walking around and you see the exhibit of the Africans. And the Africans are in mud huts, scratching themselves on their butt, throwing poop around, right? Putting on a show for the white folks. The white folks are laughing and pointing. Then you go to the next group of displays and you see the Arabs over there riding a camel and covered in like niqabs and thobes and stuff like that. And the Chinese, making paper and fireworks, and the Indians, snake charming and stuff like that. And then you go to the European section and you see people drinking from teacups, looking sophisticated. And then you go to the American and Western European section where people are, building airplanes and stuff like that. They were trying to push this social Darwinist, this evolutionary progressive form of I would say, liberalism to some degree, where they said, look how the African is at the lowest stage of human development and how the white European and the white American are at the highest stage. This is the image that they were trying to put in the Europeans' minds. And let's remember, over 50 million white Europeans traveled to Paris on multiple occasions, not just once, but twice, to look at the exhibit of black people in zoos. Have we ever done that to them? Did we capture white folks? Did we capture white women, white children, young poor white men, bring them back to Africa and put them on display for the Africans so that they can point, laugh at them, throw sticks and stones and rotten food at them? Did we do that? No, no, no. A lineage of evil. A lineage of evil. Although there were the beginnings of anti-colonial protest at such exhibitions in interwar Paris, in general, we can speculate that the degrading and racist display of black people probably powerfully reinforced popular stereotypes of Africans as savages, who are at the bottom of the human evolutionary chain, quite literally placed on show like animals in a zoo. Spectators fed monkey nuts to a group of Congolese who were shown in traveling colonial exhibitions in Belgium. The animality of blacks, a dangerous savagery that created a frisson of horror and delight in white audiences, was emphasized by a symbolism of containment, of compound fences, and of ring masters, billed as great white hunters and animal trainers who brought a touch of racial mastery to the show. Frisson is a word I don't know. Let's see if my dictionary man Kamal can put it in the chat. Let's see if we can find the definition of frisson. Let us know what frisson means. But I would say a friction A friction of horror is what I assume it would mean. If I can't get a definition from the people in the chat, I'll look it up myself later. But let's continue. So, the very first major display of Africans at the Paris Jardin des Acclamations in 1877 was organized by a foreign merchant whose speciality is furnishing interesting specimens to the zoological gardens of Europe and who is supplied by paying local hunters. The circus entrepreneur and creator of savage South Africa, Frank Phillis, had recruited the Zulus among white farmers in Natal through an advertisement in the press. Wanted, horned animals, baboons, zebras, giraffe, kudu, springbuck, hartebeest, young Afrikander girls, good-looking and to be slightly colored. The skills of Phillis were praised in the London press. He has achieved some wonderful results in the training of the troops of savages and incidentally of the horses also. Sick. So the Europeans were saying, we need a bunch of animals for a zoo. We need some springbucks, some zebras, some kangaroos, and some black people in our zoos. Going here to frisson. Let's look up what frisson means. So sick of these French words in the text. This is one of the reasons, one of the things that I think writers need to stop. So frisson. Frisson is a noun. Let's put this in the chat. Hold on. Putting this here. Frisson. Hyphen, paste. All right, noun. Noun. A sudden, strong feeling of excitement or fear, a thrill. Interesting. So it created some excitement of horror and delight in audiences, building up the Negro philophobia. All right. So, although with hindsight, the crude propaganda purposes of native display can be readily discerned, it is interesting to note that even the most sensationalist exhibits sought to provide a guarantee of authenticity by providing them with a scientific gloss. As Annie Combes has argued, exhibitions and museums displays had a close relationship with the developing discipline of anthropology, which had much to gain in prestige by becoming associated with the enormously popular displays. Before 1914, the armchair anthropologists of Europe rarely carried out any kind of field work, and they welcomed the convenient arrival of Africans to carry out direct research. On the first display of exhibited Africans in Paris in 1877, the Anthropological Society established a committee to carry out investigations armed with calipers, tape measures, and cameras. Its members recorded the physical features of the natives, who were appropriately paid with little trinkets. In return, the exhibitions, which laid claim to authenticity and the educational advantage of their displays, were able to gain considerable legitimation from the close association with physical anthropologists, invited to advise on displays and catalogs, and with famous explorers like Stanley, who could lay claim to expertise. The great exhibitions thus provided a crucial bridge between the field of academic race science and popular forms of racism. The linkage can be further seen in the development of related forms of showing African peoples and their culture. Ethnological museums that spread throughout the major cities of Europe from the 1860s onwards, from London and Liverpool to Cologne, Dresden, and Bergen, invented displays of artifacts, from spears and drums to clothing and fetish statues that were placed in an evolutionary sequence, with the most primitive African forms at the bottom of the hierarchy. The partition of Africa led to a vast flow of such plundered materials into the museums of Europe. Anthropologists, missionaries, and explorers, as well as commercial photographers in colonial Africa, made increasing use of the camera, especially the light and portable Kodak, to record the great variety of races and cultures. Such photographs were reproduced in vast numbers in the form of millions of postcards, illustrations to school textbooks, missionary publications, and popular compilations like the Harmsworth History of the World. Such images, many of which were fakes claiming to represent cannibals, fetish worshippers, slaves, nude beauties, and other exotica of darkest Africa, were invariably presented above texts that guaranteed their scientific and anthropological veracity as racial types. Such accessible images, doubly convincing because of their apparent objectivity and reality, had an enormous impact on a wider public. In the whole range of representation, from exhibition catalogs to museum displays and postcards, there was an intense preoccupation presentation with the minute description and recording of the African body, a way of looking that reflected the impact of physical anthropology and racial science on a broader popular culture. All right, Kamal jumped into the chat. He said a frisson is a sudden thrill or rush of excitement. Shout out to Kamal. He's a dictionary man. I might have some delay. The thing is, I think when I'm speaking, all of you have like a 2-minute delay from when I say something. So maybe having the dictionary person won't be as useful if there's that delay. But I'll still try it. Let's try it out next time. I might have jumped ahead and put the definition out there before you heard me request it. But shout out to Kamal for showing love and showing support by giving that definition. Anyway, remember, so what they're talking about here is the creation of the mass media. Like I said, white supremacy hit at the right place at the right time. Because at the same time that white supremacy was allowing the Europeans to create all of these racial categories of people and dehumanize blackness and racialize different groups of people, they also had the mass media being created at the same time. The Kodak camera was created. Mass printing presses were created or becoming more widespread. So when the people who went to the human exhibits at the Paris World Fair or the other places where they displayed Africans in zoos, they took pictures of that, and those pictures ended up in school textbooks of children. They ended up in postcards for people. They ended up in official documents, in posters, in all sorts of ways. So the mass media was able to infect people's minds even if they hadn't been there, which is why you can still find images of black people in zoos today, why you can still find so many of these images that were circulating at the beginning of the 20th century regarding black people as no different than animals or at a lower stage of human development. That's because those images and those writings and those texts and those events were still able to permeate long after they were finished. So let's continue here. Mass culture and race. The diffusion of racial stereotypes of Africans within European society occurred through a vast array of other channels, although the basic messages were the same as those already explored for the processes of exhibiting and display. Go into the comments. Kamal says delay. Now it makes sense. Yes, the delay is the big problem. But we're still going to try the dictionary thing. We're going to try it one more time if I come across a strange word. So, let's continue here. I'm going to start over. The diffusion of racial stereotypes of Africans within European society occurred through a vast array of other channels, although the basic messages were the same as those already explored for the processes of exhibiting and display. This has been studied in most detail for Britain, where an astonishing range of materials, products, and organizations spread jingoistic, colonial, and racist texts and images between 1870 and 1914. John Mackenzie, for example, has studied this enormous range of sources of imperial propaganda and the diverse forms of advertising and packaging, tea, chocolate, soap, music hall acts, missionary slideshows, juvenile literature, Henty, John Buchan, Ryder Haggard, school textbooks, youth organizations, Boy Scouts, Church Lads Brigade, and colonial organizations, Primrose League, British Empire League. Robert Roberts, that's a horrible name. If your parents name you Robert Roberts, you were not meant to be born. Robert Roberts, in his semi-autobiographical account of life in the slums of Salford between 1914, recorded the impact of imperialism and ultra-patriotism on the local children, of Seeley's The Expansion of England, Kipling, Empire Day, and the penny weeklies that diffused a public school ethos of heroic combat with savages. Britain was unusual in the extent to which popular culture became steeped in imperial and racial values. The picture in continental Europe is much less clear, in part reflecting the little research that has been carried out on this topic in countries like Hungary and Poland, but also the historic reality of a much lower level of involvement or interest in colonial matters. However, although each European state had its own quite specific national cultural traditions, it seems probable that anti-black racial stereotyping was a universal feature of European popular culture. William Schneider has shown how an unprecedented flood of information reached the French public on Africa and blacks, both through the great exhibitions as well as the mass press journals like the Petit Parisien and the Petit Journal, which both reached circulation figures of over 1 million by the 1890s. Those colonial states that were most involved in the great international exhibitions, notably Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, also had the greatest diffusion of colonial images and text in advertising, postcards, newspapers, children's books, comics, and other ephemera. So basically what he's trying to say here is, I'm going to read a bit further. I think some of us now tend to think the globalized world where information from different countries and places, even where people don't speak our language, travels fastly and translates quicker. We tend to think that's a modern invention, or that recently happened in the late or mid 20th century. But the same thing was happening. Mass media, the translation of newspapers, letters, postage across boundaries, across geographic lines, was happening at the same time. Information spread quickly all over Europe. There was a mass media. There was a different type of mass media than what we know with the internet and TV and radio, even though they didn't have those things back then, or if they had them, they weren't widely circulated. At the same time, even though they didn't have the internet, they were still able to get anti-black messaging all throughout Europe, through their newspapers, through their posters, through the propaganda that came from the imperial states. So even though Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, whatever, were not directly colonizing black folks and creating the racial caste systems, they were still imbibing and consuming and inculcating within their own cultures anti-black stereotypes. And as well, they exhibited black people in zoos, in their national parks, in their world fairs that they hosted in their major cities. Continuing here. As one moved east through Europe, away from the maritime states, there appears to have been a falling away in the sheer volume of racial propaganda. For example, Spain, Germany, Russia, and Austria did not have a strong presence in the international exhibitions. Spain had lost most of her colonial territories by 1900, and participation would only have been a humiliating symbol of imperial decline and failure. German colonies in Africa, while extensive, were weakly developed and could not compare to the vast possessions of Britain and France. And so imperial displays could do little to show German great power status compared to that of her rivals. Both Russia and Austria, without a maritime colonial tradition and oriented towards the landlocked areas of Central Asia, had little interest in the exhibitions. Recent research into the early history of the cinema provides the most interesting new insights into the process through which vivid images of colonial peoples were diffused into almost every small town and village of Europe, from Spain to the Caucasus. Between the first public showing of a film by the Lumiere brothers in a Paris cafe in December 1895, and the First World War cinema spread globally with an astounding speed. As a Belgian newspaper noted in 1909, which illustrated newspaper, which book, which theater can compare with the cinematograph as a propagator of ideas? Basically, what theater, what book can compare with movies, with cinema? Which is a reason why Acting and I review movies, because film has a certain way of penetrating the mind and putting into people images that needs to be analyzed. We need to be critical about what we consume with our eyes, with our ears, and cinema is one of those ways that we do that. So that's why we do the film reviews. And yeah, the white person back then who wrote this for a Belgian newspaper said, yeah, a newspaper, books, plays cannot compete with movies as far as spreading ideas. And we're going to see that films were great ways of spreading anti-black propaganda in Europe. In America, we know this very well with the very first blockbuster film, Birth of a Nation, which showed the Klan rampaging over the South, trying to destroy Reconstruction efforts to give black people the right to vote and participate in society. Continuing here. A new film coming out from Paris will within 3 months be seen across the globe by 300 million spectators. So keen were the early film entrepreneurs to cash in on the public interest in images of black Africans that they either, like George Millet in 1896, used black American actors to play out scenes, or they filmed the native villages in the Great Exhibitions, as at Tervuren in Belgium in 1897, or Paris in 1900. From 1900 onwards, British, Belgian, and French companies organized expeditions specifically to shoot films in Africa. And this growing footage was increasingly utilized by Catholic missionaries as well as by colonial associations to promote imperial interests and the civilizing mission in thousands of small towns, village halls, and schools. Some companies like the Belgian Cinématographe de Colonie, or the Film Association of the Colonies of Belgium, founded in 1908, were specifically dedicated to the genre of exotic travel and colonial film production. That such powerful moving images of black Africa were able to penetrate rapidly into even the most isolated rural areas of Europe was due to the activity of thousands of traveling projectionists, many of them descendants of the traditional fairground exhibitors and showmen. By 1902, such entrepreneurs had even reached into the Caucasus and Asia Minor, and by 1910, permanent cinemas had been established as far away as Baku, which had 8 cinemas, Kazan, 10, and Kiev, 12. So basically what they're saying here is like, a lot of white people in Europe were interested in black folks because a lot of the creation of whiteness depends upon how you view and how you obsess over the black body, and also Africa as a spatial, temporal entity. So they set up these film associations to basically film black people in Africa and also take pictures of Africa to bring that back to Europe. And then also they're twisting that propaganda to make black folks look like savages and animals. So don't ever let these Europeans tell you that we don't have a history of racism here. We haven't known black people. We've never seen black people until recently in ex-European country, whether that be Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, whatever. Don't let them say that, because all throughout Europe, the people were traveling around with films and opening up cinemas showing black people as less than human on screen. So, such geographical diffusion was aided by the rapid development of new cinema technologies. The Pathé Koch projector, which sold 2,000 on its launch in 1913, was able to reach into villages without electricity since a hand-cranked dynamo supplied the light's current, while simultaneously turning the film mechanism. The rate of cinema expansion is partly reflected in the increase in cinefilm production by the German AGFA factory from 111,000 meters in 1908 to 20 million in 1912. While it is safe to conclude that film, which had a novel and astonishing impact on the public, reached into every corner of Europe by 1914, we know little of the impact that moving images of black Africans had upon audiences. Yuri Sivian argues that no matter where any film claimed to be located, it was often perceived as set in a nondescript macaronic universe. Macaronic. I need that. I'm going to use some context clues. Macaronic, meta-ironic, maybe? I don't know. Somebody look up this word, macaronic. Is that like macaroni and cheese universe? The universe where macaroni and cheese is prevalent? I don't know. Anyway, please, somebody, let's have Brother Kamal, if you could come up there. Comrade Kamal, sorry. Even I slip up and say brother sometimes. Comrade Kamal, we need some dictionary help. So it was often perceived as set in a nondescript macaronic universe, or what Michel Foucault would define as heterotopia, spaces lacking in cultural or geographic identity. It seems likely that uneducated peasant or industrial workers would, however, no matter how nondescript the images of primitives, have absorbed the traditional stereotypes of the African as a naked, spear-waving heathen, devoid of clothing, living in jungle zones without even the most basic qualities of civilization. Indeed, as always, it was the intention of the filmmakers to emphasize such stereotypical representations either in the interest of increasing profits through sensationalism and the exotic, witch doctor rituals, cannibalism, or in order to legitimate the colonial and missionary enterprise by demonstrating how necessary and enlightened European intercession was. Occasionally, a rare glimpse is afforded of the impact of such stereotypes upon European popular culture. In the Cornish fishing town of Padstow, an ancient tradition of was transformed in about 1900 into an annual revel called the Darky Day. This is so hard. The Darky Day. Oh, God. Sometimes I read this stuff and I cringe. Darky Day. Let's read this back. Occasionally, a rare glimpse is afforded of the impact of such stereotypes upon European popular culture. In the Cornish fishing town of Padstow, an ancient tradition of guys dancing was transformed in about 1900 into an annual revel called the Darky Day, in which locals blacked themselves up in the American minstrel tradition as plantation slaves and sang songs accompanied by ukulele and accordion. The Darky Day was still going strong in 1998 in England. All right. Jerry online says, "What the f?" Yes, what the fuck? What is actually happening here? Darky Day was still going strong in 1998 in England, and was still going strong in 1998 when it came under criticism from the Council of Radical Equality in Cornwall. Photographs of the interwar Lord Mayor's procession in Norwich show locals blacked up as naked savages carrying spears and bows. That's crazy. I have to see that. We got to see Darky Day. Darky Day, Cornwall. We got to see these images, man. Yep. These are the whites. Y'all see them here. These are the whites of Cornwall on Darky Day. These are the whites of Cornwall on Darky Day, doing blatant blackface in HD, full color pictures. This ain't 1960, baby. This is 1996. This is Cornwall, baby. Cornwall, UK. Doing blackface from the past to the present. From the past to the present. The whites were doing blackface in Cornwall, England. Now, I'm not surprised because I read about this. In the book Black and British by David Olusoga, which all of you should pick up. Blackface was common in the UK for a long, long, long time, going back to Shakespeare when they were doing plays of Othello. Yeah, the Moor was in blackface in Shakespeare plays. But I'm just still very surprised because I don't remember hearing about Darky Day in David Olusoga's book. Oh, God, that's David Cameron right there. That's David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of the UK, at Darky Day. Absolutely horrific. They would do blackface in Cornwall. Sick. All right. Jerry Online says, also, that's crazy that event was happening in the UK in 1998 because they had the whole Jamaican immigrants coming around in the 1960s. Absolutely true. The Windrush generation should have stomped them out. But you know what it is? Those Jamaicans in the UK, too busy pogging. Big booty pogging will have you letting the whites do blackface right in front of your eyes. Chasing them pogs, well, when we should be on them pogs' asses and not stopping them. We need to stop pogging so much and check white folks. Or we could do both at the same time. Maybe we could do both. Maybe we could pog and at the same time call out the tomfoolery from the whites. We don't like it. And I don't want to hear it's their culture. It ain't their culture. It's discriminatory. All right. Let's continue here. Anti-black racism in Germany. The racist stereotyping of blacks was generalized even without those European societies that had no direct involvement in colonialism. The phenomenon of what Sander Gilman has called blackness without blacks can be explored in more detail with relation to the German-speaking lands. A study of Germany helps provide some answers to the question of how it was possible for the vast majority of people within a society to share quite marked and consistently racist attitudes towards a minority with whom they had no direct physical contact. The German case is valuable since it provides an insight into the ways in which popular racism was diffused in all areas of Europe, including the isolated rural areas of the major colonial powers, where there was no physical black presence. Suzanne Zantop has investigated the depth of the German colonial fantasy in the period 1770 to 1880, the century before the acquisition of any overseas colonies. The educated German elite throughout this period devoured popular collections of travel and exploration, like the 21-volume General History of Travels by Sea and by Land, 1747 to 7074, studied African skulls and artifacts, and debated all of the central issues of plantation slavery, abolition, and racial scientific theory. Leading anthropologists like Johann Blumenbach, Christoph Meiners, and S.T. Sommering developed all the classical racial theories of black difference, cultural inferiority, low intellect, and physical proximity to the apes. The major philosophers from Kant to Hegel and Schopenhauer speculated on the nature of the black race, while popular dramatists like Kotzebue in The Negro Slaves of 1796 and Kleist, Betrothal in Santo Domingo in 1811, presented the issue of slavery in the theaters of Berlin and Vienna. Going here to Kamal, by the way, he says macronic, playful mixing of languages. Interesting. Okay, so the mixing of languages as in the display. Let's go back to where the word was used. Yes, it was often perceived as a set in a nondescript macronic universe, basically where languages go back and forth, where people are speaking English even if they live in a foreign land. Basically, all American films are macronic. We make a film about Napoleon, and Napoleon talks like he came from Nebraska. So that's macronic. Go in here. Jerry Online says, leave it to the Germans, man. Always leave it to the Germans to go above and beyond with the racism. Always leave it to the Germans to go above and beyond. They always take it to the extreme. A German takes everything to the extreme. All right? Continuing here. So, nor did the classic anti-black stereotype remain restricted to the elites, but became diffused more generally within German society. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, 1719, gave rise to the proliferation of a vast number of national variants and adaptations, known as Robinsonades, that appeared everywhere from Switzerland, Silesia, and Thuringia to Russia and Greece. For example, Joachim Kemp's Robinson the Younger, A Reader for Children, published in Hamburg 1779, had gone through 117 editions by 1894 and influenced a whole generation of late 19th century colonialists. Robinsonades, in addition to scenes of cannibalism and black savagery, conveyed the central message of the European hero who not only conquers the tropical wilderness, but also brings a superior intelligence to bear on the taming and education of Friday. In Heinrich Hoffmann's popular nursery story, Der Stupperwelpeter, children who mocked a black boy because of his color were then punished by a type of St. Nicholas who threw them into a giant inkwell from which they emerged even blacker. This cautionary tale carried the ambiguous notion that being black was a punishment, the inverse of a popular theme in advertising throughout Europe, the wonderful powers of that soap which could even wash the black white. Even before the establishment of African colonies, German advertising made full use of black stereotypes, as in the promotion of chocolates, the Sarati Mor from 1868. Liebig soups, cigars, and other products using images of a degraded gollywog type. And for people that don't know, gollywog is another word for black people. It's a very old slur. All right. The post-emancipationist image of the compliant black was also diffused in Germany, as it was throughout Europe, by the translation of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1853. The Hamburg animal trader and zoo director Karl Hagenbeck organized a traveling show of exotic animals and peoples, which he referred to in the standard pseudo-scientific way as anthropological zoological exhibits. While the painter Paul Friedrich Meyerheim, in his picture The Savages, 1873, captured a scene of blacks performing before a peasant or village audience. Perhaps the groups that had a bigger influence on the formation of the popular attitudes towards the black than any other, both in Germany as elsewhere, were the Catholic and Protestant missions. Church organizations were able to provide a direct link between missionaries who had a first-hand experience of Africa and the most isolated parish, schools, and churches. Missionaries frequently emphasized the shocking paganism of Africa in order to increase support for their own activities. Like Mallet of the Nordenstusch mission in Bremen, who wrote in 1854 of the heathen that the devil has exercised unlimited dominion over them for so long that they have become the slaves and have sunk into beastly and hellish conditions. So this very long paragraph is essentially saying here, throughout Germany, even though Germany did not have colonies until very late in the game of carving up Africa, Germany did have colonies in Namibia and other parts of Africa as well. But Basically, the Germans were publishing books talking about people going to Africa, doing colonization, and being heroic white saviors, bringing intelligence and civilization to the cannibals and the heathens. They were also deep into race science as well. Their major philosophers like Kant and Hegel were seriously about whether blacks were no different than animals. And once again, white supremacy hit at the right place at the right time for it to take full effect. Because let's say white supremacy came about during a time when ancient Romans were colonizing Africa, and let's say they were bringing back many, many black slaves to Europe or something like that. But there was no mass media. There was no way of perpetuating these images. They didn't have the hand crank cinematographer. They weren't able to mass produce pictures and postcards and images. They weren't able to send information vastly out in areas. At the same time, we might not be living in this world that we live in now. But white supremacy hit at the right time, at the right place, because we had all these technological inventions that made the mass media even more pertinent, powerful, potent, and viral. Now images, books, and information could spread all over the place, and people could pick it up and carry it and do with it what they will. Kamal says, Gallywag, educational. Check mark. Okay. Let's not bring back Gallywag, though. We're not trying to bring that back. All right. Let's continue here. So the fragmentary evidence for pre-colonial and colonial Germany might suggest that anti-black stereotypes were far more prevalent in Europe than has been generally acknowledged. Research in this field for Central and Eastern Europe has been almost non-existent, but even in pre-revolutionary Russia, the degrading American stereotype of the black minstrel, Sambo, or coon type was used on posters to advertise the craze for ragtime music and dancing in the dying years of the Tsarist regime. What were the functions, if any, of such racial stereotyping? Firstly, for the vast majority of European blacks constituted a purely external other. Firstly, for the vast majority of Europeans, blacks constituted a purely external other. Schoolboys may have gained a vicarious thrill from adventure books that recounted the heroic deeds of white men battling with evil cannibals, but everybody knew that black people offered no fundamental threat to those who lived within the bounds of European society. There were no literary fantasies or paranoid anxieties relating to a black invasion or a black peril internal to Europe, as there were within colonial societies. Europeans were far too sure and arrogant in their immense racial and technological superiority to feel any danger from the arrows and spears of primitive peoples, who were held to have no power of invention and no history. Some historians have argued that the European public was largely indifferent to imperialism, and that colonialism played little part in domestic politics. This was not the case, however, for Western Europe in general, and the German case can again be used to provide an excellent example of the logic of colonialism. So basically what they're saying here is that, the Europeans of Germany might have spread and amongst themselves spoken of and created anti-black imagery and stuff like that. But they were saying, hey, these are just our ideas. We're never going to have to deal with black folks, right? Germany will always be a 100% white nation, mostly homogenous, and Germany to this day has remained so, right? Germany to this day is one of the homogenous white European countries, right? Right? Hope y'all are catching the sarcasm. Going to Kamal, he says, never, check mark. Yes, let's never bring back Gollywag. All right, continuing here. Germany, more so than Britain and France, experienced the enormous disruptive impacts of late and extremely rapid industrialization. The conservative Bismarck, faced with the beginning of the Great Depression, 1873 to 1896, and the rise of the Red Peril, utilized social imperialism as an ideology of crisis management. Until the early 1880s, Bismarck was a reluctant imperialist, opposed to the high costs of official colonial expansion, but changed ground when he began to recognize the potential of imperialism for integrating a state torn by class differences through focusing attention on successes abroad. Official colonial expansion also linked to an economic turning point marked by a rejection of liberalism and free trade and a move towards protectionism and towards colonies as captive zones of trade, settlement, and raw materials. The German drive into Africa was also inspired by a fear that other powers would soon take all, leaving Germany out in the cold. The partition of Africa was based less on rational economic calculations than on perceptions of pegging out a future stake. Thus, stabilization of the social order was closely linked to a new imperialism, and as Bismarck remarked, for internal reasons, the colonial question is one of vital importance for us. Similar factors can be seen at work in both Britain and France after 1880. In this dramatic shift towards an accelerated competition for empire for a stake in Africa, the creation of popular support for colonialism was a major significance, and central to the selling of empire was racism, a message of inherent white superiority that was diffused in the vast array of novels, boys' adventures, travel books, missionary tracts, and popular journals on Africa. A direct linkage between colonial economic interests and the social imperialist strategy of winning over the working class to colonialism can readily be established. The organization of works outings to the great colonial exhibitions was undertaken directly by commercial and imperial interest groups. For example, the executive committee of the Franco-British exhibition of 1908 had several leading figures from the British Empire League, such as Sir John Cockburn, the Earl of Derby, Viscount Selborne, and Lord Blythe. The mayor Ethnological Museum in Liverpool encouraged educational visits by school children and workers. On displays were numerous artifacts from West Africa that had been presented by Sir Alfred Jones, a powerful magnate with interest in Africa and director of the Elder Dempster shipping line, who encouraged his senior employees in West Africa to collect ethnographic materials which were shipped to Liverpool at no cost. The dominant racial messages that were diffused throughout the states with a colonial stake was quite simple in its formulation. The indigenous people were so inherently backward that they required the direct intervention of the superior white race to bring them education, science, medicine, and economic development. Although some literature contained traces of a social Darwinism that justified racial extermination the inferior blacks would have to make way for the whites, the dominant discourse was that of the civilizing mission. Colonial powers generally recognized the need to retain native peoples as the basic workforce, particularly in tropical areas where the climate made dense European settlement impossible. Where the modern forms of racism differed fundamentally from the older Enlightenment and liberal ideology was its claim that biological and hereditary characteristics of blacks and whites were so invariable and determinate that the former could never be lifted to the same level as the latter. This justified a future colonial scenario in which the European domination and guardianship would continue indefinitely, since the African would always require the superior political skills, inventiveness, energy, and advanced culture of the white man. Although this racist discourse did not go totally unchallenged within European society, underlying the colonial policies of left and right, of social democrats and Marxists, as well as conservatives and liberals, was an unquestioning assumption of black inferiority. Once again, we have no allies. We have no allies. We have no allies. Even amongst the leftists, even amongst the Marxists, even amongst them. We take some things from Marxism. We take some things from a liberal or a leftist critique of capitalism. But we have to understand, capitalism can't explain why they hung us from trees and cut our dicks off. Capitalism alone can't explain why they made films depicting us as savages for entertainment, when other ways could have been made of making money. There are some things that capitalism or a capitalistic critique cannot explain. That was a very interesting chapter, and that's, once again, this book is just a primer into certain things related to the history of racism in Europe. This book is an introduction because each section alone could be a 300-page book covering the topic: the history of anti-black racism in Germany, the history of displaying black people in zoos, etc., etc. These things could be expounded on indefinitely because the history is that deep and rich, but the history is hidden because they don't expect black folks to be reading books. They don't expect black folks to be entertained or engaged by text. They don't expect black men to be actually using the muscle between our shoulders, and that's why we do these live streams. The Book to React series is the series I'm most proud to do on my channel. It's the series I'll continue to do on my channel. Whether 3 people are watching, 300 or 3,000, I don't care. This is very important that we continue to educate ourselves, enlighten people on what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen if we don't educate ourselves, and also continue to shine light on places of history that do not get enough attention, and also authors that deserve more attention and shine. So I'm going to wrap this up here. Shout out to everybody that tuned into the live stream. Shout out to my guy Kamal. Shout out Jerry Online. And shout out anybody else who's going to watch this in the playback. Remember, before we start the live streams, every time we do the Book to React series, we'll be reading the comments. We'll always be reading the comments. Shout out to Jerry Online. He says, I'm going to keep showing up, man. Shout out to you as well. And make sure if you have anything that you thought is text, right? Put it in the comments, because we will always read the comments at the beginning of every Book to React series. And y'all be easy out there. Catch you tomorrow. 1 hour at least. We read one day, every day, 1